Thanks very much for the kind introduction. And I want to also extend my thanks for the opportunity to be here. I've been here really at ANU for about a month to my friend and colleague, Professor John Ravenhill, who I've known for many years. And we talked for a while about trying to work out this kind of invitation. And I really appreciate the support of the school and of John for the opportunity to be here. It's also been a great opportunity to engage with a variety of colleagues here, learn more about some really exciting work being done here at ANU on a variety of issues on the international agenda. I've had the opportunity also to be in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne and give talks on various subjects there. I get to see a little bit of the country, not as much as I'd like, but a little bit of the country. And I also should say I've known for many years and have had the opportunity to work with your very distinguished Chancellor, Gareth Evans. Both in government and in my academic work, I've worked a lot on the responsibility to protect issues. And he's been really an extraordinary leader on, probably more than any other individual, the impact that he has had. So it's been a great opportunity for me to be here. I've learned a lot and am really, really appreciative of the opportunity. I've been addressing a lot of different issues about U.S. foreign policy in different talks that I've given. And when we get to the Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about any issue that you'd like. But I thought it would really be useful to really approach this in a much broader way in terms of starting with the title of the talk, Pivots and Other Priorities. The notion of the pivot, which has become, I guess I didn't realize all of the use of that term in the context till I actually came to the region. But I want to put this, what's going on in the U.S. role in Asia and the U.S. role with China, in this broader context of U.S. global strategy. And I'd like to address these issues in a way that, say, goes beyond what we see in the media, but consistent with being in an academic environment, to really make an argument for you about where I think United States foreign policy is, and where we need to shift our overall foreign policy, or grand strategy, as some like to call it, in two respects. First, to one that's geared to the 21st century, which I will talk about as the first truly global era in history. It's not unipolarity. It's not just going to be a new China-U.S. bipolarity, nor even a 21st century version of 19th century multipolarity. With the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, and India taking their seats at the table. It's much broader and deeper than that. And secondly, in that context, I want to try to outline what I call a strategy of sustainable security, which I'll define as I go along, both for the U.S. role in this region and more globally. And as someone who has been a supporter of the Obama administration, has served in it, I think this administration has taken some steps in that direction. In some ways in which it has not. Even given that, I think it's moving in that direction far more than its predecessor, the George W. Bush administration did, and far more than Mitt Romney would have done if he had been elected. But I think the success of the second term of the Obama foreign policy really depends on continuing to show that the administration understands this shift from American centrality to a global era, and that its policies, both for dealing with immediate crises and longer-term trajectories, fit this conception of sustainable security, both in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. As context for that, first let me make a couple of points about our own domestic politics, which is really the context in which the administration pursues its foreign policy. Let me just make two general points to get us started. First is that the United States clearly does have a pressing domestic agenda. And we do have some serious fiscal constraints, and we are war-weary, but we are not reverting to isolationism. The esteemed newspaper, the New York Times, as they say, all the news that fit to print, reported a poll about 2 weeks ago in which it totally distorted the result, and it had a headline saying, Americans turning to isolationism. Well, the poll question asked Americans, which is more important to you, domestic issues or international issues? Well, of course people said domestic issues. I mean, how could you not? With unemployment as high as it is and important issues out there, but nothing at that highest level of threat. If you look more closely at the other polls, it basically shows that even the average American not just people in the university world or inside the Beltway, at a fundamental level understands that it's not a question of whether isolationism is a good or a bad option. It's simply not possible. Not in relation to global terrorism, not in relation to the international economy, not in relation to a whole host of other issues. We are war-weary, and as Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said before he left office, the quote was something along the lines of, any future Secretary of Defense who advises an American president to get involved in another land war in the Middle East or Asia should have his head examined. I don't think that's isolationism. I think that's actually sound strategy. And we do have pressing domestic issues, and we do have budget deficits. But I think that the important point is the kind of shifts in American strategy that I think we've started to take and we need to take, we would be taking even if we didn't have fiscal problems. It really has more to do with how the world has changed than the simple question of resources or not. And I think what we're going through is figuring out our commitments in ways that relate to how the world has changed, not just as a function of our own fiscal issues. Secondly, as you've probably heard a lot, particularly during the presidential campaign, but more ongoing, about the so-called declinism debate. You know, is the United States in decline? Yes, it is. No, it's not. I have to say that on both counts, it's an incredibly distorting and misleading debate. In fact, in many respects, quite self-indulgent. Does the United States have as much power and influence as we did during the Cold War, or even during the first part of the post-Cold War era? No, we don't. But this is less about our decline in the sense that sort of conservative and neoconservative critics claim, as if we just had the willpower and the belief in American exceptionalism that the U.S. would reign supreme and everybody else would let us lead and either follow or get out of the way. It's really about how the world has changed. And you know, in our own debate, this really gets into sort of deep political culture and communications issues. And people who talk about shifts in power and shifts in the American role are accused of being unpatriotic. You believe in decline. Actually, the opposite is true. That if you don't understand that and try to develop your foreign policy in that context, you may not be a declinist, but you're a denialist. And if we think about that in our own personal lives, anytime there's a problem we have or a shift in a situation, if we deny the existence of that, we are less likely to be able to effectively deal with that. So again, it's not so much whether we are or aren't declining, but it's how the world is changing and how that affects the American role, power, and position. So how has this world been changing? And I'm just going to lay out, in the interest of time, some general points, and I'm happy to go back and develop them, but I really want to leave us ample time for questions and discussion. I actually think it starts with this being a very different era for us than any other era in our history. And you know, when I'm in Europe, we had a sabbatical at Oxford a few years ago, and as you may know, Duke University is less than 100 years old, but we have this, you know, Gothic sort of architecture, very, very British-like. And I was talking to someone who had, you know, gone to Duke. He'd been on my board. His children went to Duke. As we say, he bled Duke blue. And I said, I'm going to Oxford for a year. And he said, oh yeah, I was once there for a day. It reminds me of Duke, you know, 800 years, less than 100 years. I realize I'm addressing a country that actually has a slightly, in terms of Australia, since Captain Cook, as it were, a slightly less, a shorter history than us, which is a rarity to find in the world. But I think in the context of our history, we have spent much of our history either apart from the world, as we did from our founding, really up until, really up until World War I, but really up until World War II, engaging very selectively with the world, shielded by our oceans, endowed with our own tremendous resources for our own economic development, involved to a great extent in our own hemisphere, but as George Washington had advised, trying to stay out of entangling alliances with the so-called Old World. So we were very apart from the world. From World War II on through the Cold War, we kind of got used to a position atop the world. We seemed to be the center of power ideologically, economically, militarily, diplomatically, politically. I think the challenge for the United States now is we are neither apart from the world nor atop the world. But we need to figure out how to compete in this global era. And it's a very different period, and I think some of our own angst at home and some of our own debates, reflect this sense of how profoundly the world has changed. And that affects, in many ways, our domestic policies, and it affects a lot of areas. I would describe the way the world has changed that makes this notion of a truly global era. Let me just emphasize three aspects. There are more, but just for the sake of a framework for tonight. One is the diffusion of power. Second is the gap between globalization and global governance. And third is what I call the Vegas dilemma. And I'll come back to define each of these. In terms of the diffusion of power, to put it in sort of, just discussion terms, during the Cold War era, on many issues that we were faced with and the international community was faced with, the United States possessed what one might call 51% or more of the power and influence necessary to pursue our objectives, mobilizing alliances to a great extent. But that was this notion of fairly substantial power. I think when you look around the world today in this global era, the United States still possesses more power and influence than pretty much any other country on most issues. But really, as a percentage of the power and influence necessary to achieve objectives, it's about, let's call it 39%, maybe 41%. The point is, it's less than you need for the objectives. And so it makes it all the more important to forge partnerships, to set priorities, and to make choices. And why do I say that this has changed? Give you a couple of dynamics that, again, these go much beyond the United States, but I think they characterize this global era. First is a notion of the pluralization of diplomacy. It remains true that some countries are more powerful than others, but this is an era in which more countries are out there pursuing their own national interests consistent with their own national identity, history, politics, and a variety of other aspects of their interests than ever before. Which is why I said it's not just a 21st century version of 19th century multipolarity where we invite Brazil and India, maybe Indonesia, Turkey to the table. There's a version of 21st century nationalism that one finds in countries like Turkey. There's been a debate in the United States, is Turkey turning east instead of west? Turkey's pursuing its national interest. And when its national interest leads it east, it goes east. When its national interest leads it back to Europe or NATO, it goes west. When President Obama visited India in 2010, on the eve of his visit, the National Security Advisor to the Indian Prime Minister made a very strong point to say that we welcome closer relations with the United States, but India will pursue its national interest. And 21st century nationalism is not as assertive overall or aggressive or antagonistic as in other eras, but it's very much a sense of countries with their own national interests, more countries forming more relations with each other than ever before. You see that here in Asia, where in addition to the U.S.-China relations, there are bilateral and trilateral discussions going on, China, Japan, and South Korea on some issues. We see this in a variety of areas, different countries playing different roles. The Prime Minister of India made the first summit trip to Saudi Arabia in over 30 years. And this pluralization of diplomacy means that there are more actors in the diplomatic realm. It's not just sort of a hub and spokes with the U.S. at the middle and all these alliances going out. Secondly is an eastward and southward shift in economic dynamism. Choose your data about China. We all know that. We don't have to spend a lot of time on its larger and larger global economic role. But it's not just China. It's all of Asia. And it's not just Asia in the sense of eastward, it's also southward. Brazil and Mexico. Indeed, even Africa, with all of the issues that faces it, has achieved a fairly substantial GDP growth rate in the last 5 or 7 years. Overall, emerging economies have been accounting for about 60% of global growth the last few years, up from about 25% a few decades ago. The International Energy Agency projects that more than 90% of the growth in world oil demand will come from non-OECD countries. And all told, whereas in 1950, the United States, Canada, and Western Europe accounted for 68% of global GDP, the projections are for less than 30% by 2050. Again, another diffusion, if you like, of economic power with a profound shift eastward and southward, and again, not just about one country like China. A couple of other aspects of this. There are more claimants to soft power out there. My friend and colleague Joe Nye developed the idea of soft power, largely talking about the United States. But the Turkish Islamist democracy model, while not without its own internal tensions, is admired by many. Lifting 30 million people out of poverty has made Brazil a laboratory and model for globalization with a social conscience. Scandinavian social democracy is seen as getting a lot more right than others. I mean, even a country like Denmark, which has a large role for government in the economy and has gone very green in many of its policies, was designated by Forbes magazine, a business magazine, as the best country in which to do business. So soft power is a currency that many countries have possession of. But what you might say about military power? There's no question by the standard measure of capabilities, the U.S. still has a huge advantage. And that's true, but I would say with two caveats. One is that the military balance is much less central to overall systemic structure than during the Cold War strategic nuclear deterrence era. It bears heavily on some issues, such as Asia-Pacific regional security and to a certain extent Persian Gulf regional security. But in a world in which there's much less of a shared and overarching threat, the currency of military power is less convertible to other forms of power and influence than when such threats were more defining. Again, systemic factors. And second is a gap between capabilities and utility. And the United States obviously had much more military capability than the insurgents in Iraq or Afghanistan, but in neither case were we able to achieve our strategic objectives. In 2006, with concern about terrorism in Somalia, Ethiopia, with a very large army, invaded Somalia, and 2 years later had to pull out without its objectives achieved. Israel, I think, has found out that in contrast to the earlier wars, which were largely about military capabilities, that in an era, whether it was in Lebanon in 2006 or Gaza in 2008, when you're using military power for political objectives, there's this gap between capabilities and utility. By the way, this applies to China as a rising power. And I think we've seen this in very interesting ways. You know, as China became more assertive in this region, 2009, 2010, this is kind of when we got the pivot or the rebalance. And there was interest on the part of not only Australia or Japan or South Korea, but countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, of the U.S. playing more of a role in terms of balance, a pushback on China being assertive. I think one sees this in Burma, for example, the profound changes in Burma. Have had a number of motivations, one of which was, I think, a concern about some of their issues of being too dependent of China. Even in Africa, we've seen this. Very, very interesting cases. In Zambia in 2011, there was a presidential election. China invested very heavily in the Zambian economy. They had come in, and while they didn't have the human rights conditionalities that a lot of Western countries did, they actually weren't creating that many jobs. They were bringing in a lot of workers for them. They were damaging the environment and a variety of things. And the candidate of the opposition party in Zambia ran for president on what one might call a China-bashing platform. And for the first time in a long time, his party won. I was at a conference in Beijing last month, and there was a representative of South Africa civil society there who was pretty outspoken about the pressure China put on the Zuma government in South Africa to not allow the Dalai Lama to come to South Africa for Bishop Tutu's 80th birthday. Countries that are too assertive with their power, be they the United States or China, are getting a lot of pushback. So I think we see this diffusion of power in ways that make anybody's hegemony much less possible. And then, of course, we have the role of non-state actors, whether they're non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, or they're non-state actors, say, on the other side of the spectrum, like the Gates Foundation, the second largest budget for global public health issues next to the World Health Organization. There's this diffusion of power that very much characterizes this era, and that any country, including the United States, has to respond to. Two other factors, let me just mention briefly, because then I want to get to the policy strategy. One is this gap between globalization and global governance. I mean, it's a truism now to say that we in the world are interconnected in so many ways that we're all familiar with. communications, environment, movements of peoples, migration, obviously the economy, the finance sector, the trade sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the gap between the interconnectedness and the capacity to cooperate, whether it's at the international level through the United Nations or through the World Trade Organization or at the regional level, and provide the governance needed to match this interconnectedness, there's a big gap. When I teach courses back home on these issues, when you study public policy, you learn all about global public goods, which maybe some of you use those in your own courses. And I try to help my students understand the gap between the ought and the is. You know, there's lots of arguments we could make about climate change, that we all should be cooperating more. That's the ought. But the reality of the is this global governance gap. And again, I'll come back to this in a second with some ideas about how to narrow it, if not close it. The third characterization is what I called earlier the Vegas dilemma. So you all know Las Vegas. You may or may not have been there. But for a long time, there was this commercial running on American TV that said, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Not sure that's totally true. I think Prince Harry, on his earlier visit to the United States, found out it wasn't totally true, as have others. But the Vegas dilemma in our context is what happens inside states does not stay inside states. That in the Cold War, to a certain extent, we saw the internalization inside states of this external conflict and rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. What we're seeing in very profound ways in the 21st century is the externalization of internal issues coming out of states. That's what Gareth Evans' work and others on Responsibility to Protect is very much all about, in terms of atrocities happening inside states and affecting others, their neighboring countries, and the international community in profound ways. That's what some of the efforts to try to deal with the possibilities of global public health pandemics are. They start inside states, but they don't stay inside states. And this raises profound issues for all of us in the international community about the balance between the rights that states have with sovereignty and the responsibilities they have to the international community. As Kofi Annan said when he was Secretary General, the UN Charter was made in the name of the peoples of the world, not just the states. And I think figuring out this balance point on a range of issues, whether it's the atrocities issues, or it has to do with the rights to information if a pandemic is developing inside of states that other states have, or ultimately to a whole variety of issues, is really a very profound issue for this era, more so than ever before. So in all of these ways, it creates this environment of a truly global era, of high interconnectedness, again, of power distributed by no means evenly, but more diffusion of power than we've seen in other eras, and not just one power rising and another power falling. So in this context, what role should the United States play? I called it before sustainable security, and let me define it a little bit and give you some examples, both for Asia Pacific and more generally what I mean. Sustainable as an adjective modifying security, by which I mean security arrangements that can be sustained, continued over time, not just short-term tactical responses or quick fixes that ultimately tend not to stay fixed beyond the quick. That a lot of times countries say, well, let's just sort of get this out of this news cycle or deal with this. But your security arrangements have to have a degree of sustainability. The security part of the definition, a broader conception of security, still putting highest priority on war and peace issues, preventing war. But sustainability, as commonly used as regards climate change and international development, and understanding that these issues are not just out there long-term, as often asserted, that even if they are long-term, they have to start sometime, and moreover, we've started to feel their effects in the near term, in the immediate present. Again, my measure for our own foreign policy, President Obama in his second term. In a second term, American presidents are by no means out of politics, but you're less susceptible to politics and more thinking about not only how do you deal with the issues of the day, but what's your legacy, what's really important that you want to do to try to affect the world beyond your presidency. with a little bit more freedom to do that than you do in a first term. So let me give you a couple examples of what this manifests itself as. First, in terms of this region, of Asia-Pacific regional security. President Obama and President Xi Jinping are going to hold a summit very shortly, and I think that's a great thing. We've had most meetings from leaders lately have been, an hour or two on the so-called margins of another meeting, and they sit there with their talking points and they read their talking points. This is a day-and-a-half summit in an effort to try to have an opportunity to deal with a range of issues, perhaps build some trust. The United States-China relationship is the classic example of what in international relations people call the security dilemma. How do I make myself more secure without it making you feel less secure? And I was doing a panel in Sydney with a colleague who's very much of a China specialist, and she made the point that in terms of some military weaponry, what the United States talks about as anti-access capabilities for China, the Chinese refer to as counter-intervention weaponry. And even if you correct for political rhetoric, you can see the security dilemma here. And the effort really, I think, for both sides is going to be to how to find ways that get out of this security dilemma, that avoid one of the risks that we've learned from other periods of spirals where nobody really intends for tensions to be raised and for war possibly to happen, but it develops out of sort of the back and forth. And I think a key issue for the United States, and indeed I actually, in my reading and just reading others that are more knowledgeable to me, it seems to be one of the differences in the 2009-2013 Australia White Papers. That the 2009 Defense White Paper seemed to be really underlining concerns about China's growing assertiveness. The 2013 one seemed to not drop that, but also sort of say to the United States, you're our ally, we want you in the region, but we actually have our own interests here and our own relations with China and others, and we don't want you to feel that you can just go do whatever you want to do and overplay your hand in ways that damage our interests. And I think that's actually, as far as I'm concerned, the right message. That stability in this region for many decades was based upon U.S. military predominance providing a degree of security for allies. I actually think what's going to be needed in this region for sustainable security is more of a balance. Not an imbalance that allows China to be more assertive than is in the interest of other countries in this region. But U.S. military predominance really had been a means to the ends of regional security and stability. And I think to the extent that that means no longer serves the ends effectively, we really need to rethink our role along with our allies in ways that achieve a balance that both makes friends and allies in the United States feel secure and also deals with some of China's legitimate own insecurities. Maintaining the current imbalance, frankly, which favors, I think, a U.S. military predominance, I don't think is sustainable. Here's an area I think that our own policy is not quite there yet. And I think that it's one of the shifts that I'd like to see happen over the next couple of years. The other point about the region, I think, is that while the U.S.-China relationship obviously is tremendously important, much of the ultimate security in this region is going to be about what Asian Pacific countries work out with each other on a bilateral basis, on a trilateral basis, on a multilateral basis through regional institutions. And I defer here to my colleague, Professor Ravenhill, who really focuses on this area. But I think it's not just what the United States does for countries in the region, but it's really what countries work out among each other to enhance relations, to build, to strengthen various regional arrangements that are sustainable over time, and also get away from the old hub and spokes model that was based on the United States. To move to another region, just as an example of sustainable security, let me make a couple comments about the Middle East. During the Cold War, many of our gravest foreign policy failures were in what we then called the Third World, where we basically equated every form of nationalism, social reform, with monolithic Soviet communism. I think there was a great quote back in the 1950s when the CIA played a role in overthrowing the actually democratically elected government of Guatemala because it leaned left, in which the American ambassador was asked, well, how'd you know they were communists? And he said this in testimony to Congress. He said, well, sir, he said, I call it the duck test. If you're in a barnyard and you see some animals and you're not sure it's a duck, but it kind of walks like one and sounds like one and hangs out with others, then you know it's a duck. And that was sort of our criteria for the third world. I think in the Middle East right now, political Islam is here to stay. It is going to be a political factor in more countries than not. And we fundamentally, in fact, I wrote an article about this 2 years ago that I called Beware the Duck Test. We have to stop the duck test. We have to differentiate between those forms of political Islam in which we have fundamental conflicts of interest, like Al-Qaeda, and those in which we try to work out cooperative relations, like, for example, we're trying to do with Egypt now. I think the Obama administration gets a lot of credit for resisting some domestic political pressure to oppose this government because it's a political Islam government. And I think that part of a sustainable strategy is understanding that for a whole variety of reasons we can talk about, political Islam will be part of the political equation in the Middle East for a long time to come. Indeed, another way of looking about this is there was an old quote attributed to various American presidents, kind of defined our Middle East policy for a long time and elsewhere, of he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. Like, he can do whatever he wants at home, but as long as he cooperates with us. There's another quote from John Kennedy in which he said, those who make peaceful change impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And I think the United States needs to understand, consistent with sustainable security and understanding the diffusion of power, that our interests in the Middle East are less about trying to make sure that there are pro-American regimes than at least trying to avoid anti-American ones, that there's this pluralization of diplomacy in the region. And we need to learn to work with governments in which we'll have some shared interests and some that are not shared. Which is one of the reasons why I think we're seeing a new push on the Israel-Palestine issue. Secretary Kerry has made 4 trips in less than 6 months. I've worked a lot in the Middle East, both when I've been in government, worked on the peace talks, and in my own scholarly work. And it's not a region that yields a lot of truths, but if there are 2 truths I know about the Middle East, they are from an Israeli perspective. This is actually not my quote, it was from what an Israeli general once said to me, who said, we cannot be sure that peace will bring security, but we know that we will never have security without peace. And I think that very much is true. And the second one that I think there's all sorts of evidence for is that as hard as it is today, it's harder tomorrow. The Camp David Agreement with Egypt in 1978-79 had a part 2 about Palestine, Palestinians. Nothing happened. The Oslo Accord in 1993, some progress was made, but it ultimately fell apart. It's a lot harder to work these issues today than it was then, and it'll be a lot harder tomorrow. On Syria, I don't want to ignore it, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We can talk about it more. I think here, and I wrote an article for a German newspaper on this a week or so ago. Here, I think it's very important that the international community mobilize in ways that I call less a military surge than a diplomatic surge, that are in efforts to try to start to bring a political transition, to start to begin it, that will shift out the Assad government, but will require a broad international coalition, which the United States needs to be a crucial part, but the Friends of Syria coalition, which embraces about 85 countries, really needs to be a part of it. And frankly, I think the biggest problem here, in this case, unlike something like Iraq, which was the United States, is Russia. The Russians have stood in the way of Security Council action, and they continue to do that for all sorts of reasons, but I think most of them don't stand the test of scrutiny. And I think it's time that all of us started to really bring pressure. In this article I wrote the other day, I said, for a government like Saudi Arabia that that has a strong interest at stake, it should be telling the Russians that they and other Arab OPEC members will increase oil production to bring down the world oil price, which the Russian budget is basically based on. Pluralization of diplomacy, countries working together, the U.S. can provide a leadership role, but not necessarily have to do it all ourselves. The responsibility to protect issue, the R2P issue that Gareth and my friend and colleague Ramesh have worked so hard on for so many years, I think is so important because it goes back to this Vegas dilemma. And this is not just for the U.S. to do. I think the first Obama administration made a stronger commitment to this than any other previous administration. And I think we know three things about trying to prevent mass atrocities: that it's extremely difficult, Syria, that it's possible, which I think was done in Libya, even though there were other issues there, and that it's necessary. Because so much of the killing and the war we see is inside countries. And I think if we're going to have a sustainable security strategy and regime, we really have to do something about this. Let me just mention one other issue and then close in the interest of time, and that is very much the sustainability of climate change and other global environmental issues. This really exemplifies the earlier point about the long term no longer being just out there in the future, but it's really affecting us already. And here, mea culpa. I mean, the United States is not providing leadership. We can't even pass anything close to a climate change bill in our own legislature. I know you've had some carbon tax controversies here in Australia. And we still are debating, is it a problem, when much of the rest of the world is trying to debate what's the solution. One study recently looked at 11,944 peer-reviewed science papers between 1991 and 2011, written by 29,083 authors, of whom 98.4% concluded global warming was being caused by human actions. 1.2% rejected and 0.4% were uncertain. I don't know how much clearer one can be on the science of this. And climate change is the essence of stability, not only ways it affects the environment, but ways that it leads to warfare. The Darfur conflict had one of its causes in environmental degradation, and there's been a lot of work recently on how this has contributed to the problems in Syria and the like. This actually is an area in which if the United States and China could come to an agreement between us about what we're prepared to do, given that we account for about 80% of global emissions, we could sort of lay the groundwork for others to add to that. And it may be an area that President Obama and Xi Jinping spend some time on in their summit. But I think this is an issue that we absolutely have to take action on. If the Israeli and Palestinian conflict is harder tomorrow than it is today, that really applies in a fundamental way to climate change. These are very much issues, I think, that are important for the United States. They're important for the rest of the international community. We can't close that globalization, global governance gap on our own. This is going to take efforts at a lot of different levels, at the United Nations, at other international institutions. We've had more than a decade since the last international multilateral trade agreement, the longest period since World War II. It's going to be a multi-level global governance effort. International institutions, regional organizations. Organizations like ASEAN are much more limited than, say, the organizations in Europe, but what we see in every region of the world is regional organizations playing a larger role today than they did 20 years ago. And at the level of national governments trying to take care of what we need to take care of. Ultimately, there have to be many pieces of this. I think because of the U.S. position, because of still being the largest economy in the world, something a country looked to by a lot to provide leadership, we do need to have a leadership strategy that fits a global era. And it's not one in which we just say to our partners, here's your talking points, do as I say. It's not one where we just assume all the best ideas are made in Washington. Believe me, they're not. And I think it's one in which we try to take into account all of these factors, the diffusion of power, this deep interconnectedness, and think about sustainable strategies. And I think there are some indications from President Obama and his administration that we are making some moves in this direction. But I think ultimately his foreign policy will be judged not only on how he handled the specific issues that filled the inbox, but whether or not he uses his prestige, his incredible communication skills, and frankly an extraordinary mind, analytically and intellectually, and good political instincts to try to help the United States use our role to shift towards policies both on our part and work with others that fit this global era and lead us more towards this sort of overarching, integrated, sustainable security strategy. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So I'll throw it open to the floor, and who would like to kick off with a question, a comment? In the back, we have a microphone, although it's a small hall. We've got a mic.
Testing one. Thank you, sir. Very engaging and informed address. Mike Fogarty is my name. I'm glad you didn't mention the L word or the LD word, being lame duck. But I think President Obama, faces the same political problems that any government forms in the West, certainly Australia, without making too much of it. He's only in for 8 years. Roosevelt got a bit longer. But there's only so much you can do, and there's a cycle of change. And that hot potato was transferred to someone else. In terms of appealing for a legacy of all this pluralism, with my career in diplomacy for so many years, some problems cannot be solved, resolved. They exist only to be managed, and we see that every day, sir.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and I think while one gets to be, a lamer duck as one rolls into the last year of one's second term, there is a bit of a freeing effect. Indeed, we've seen this in many American presidents who have paid more attention to foreign policy in their second term, sometimes to get away from domestic problems. But I think it allows one to think, obviously one has to deal with whatever comes over the transom, right? So you've got a Syria, and you had a Libya, and you have other issues. We have tensions in this region between, over the islands between Japan and China. But I think my points were a couple. One is in dealing with those issues, to try to deal with them in ways that don't just provide sort of a Band-Aid and have them come back at you because they just refill your inbox. But to try to think of things, and it's not, it's to manage these issues. It's not necessarily to make them go away. In the summit with President Xi Jinping, I think that the discussion is going to be over a couple things. It's going to be one, where do we have shared interests? Interestingly enough, North Korea may be moving more in that direction. I know when I was in Beijing last month, informally, I had comments like, wait a second, we're the big country, they're the little country. Who do they think they are creating, situations that are not in our interest, referring to North Koreans, and also, a little bit more derisive, who does this 28-year-old guy think he is, right? And so I think one's seen some interesting shared interests there. And then I think there has to be an understanding that we will not resolve in one summit or even longer the conflicting claims over islands between China and Japan, or China and many other countries in the South China Sea. And there's history that plays into these, as well. And I think there that the goal of the two leaders is to try to develop understandings for crisis prevention and crisis management. And that fits, I think, with your think of managing problems. That's the difference, I think, between situations that you can't solve, having them escalate, to greater crises and possibly war, and managing the tensions so that you can, prevent them from escalating and work on the area. So these relationships are about what are our shared interests. Let's be realistic about what our divergent interests are, and let's try to have a greater understanding about, about how to deal with those, how to compete as necessary. But we can't afford to focus on one issue area, which is why, I have to say, since I've been here, sometimes I feel like the pivot was almost like the new Mr. X, the new great pronouncement of U.S. strategy. And I was in the session in Sydney when we were doing this panel. Somebody asked the question, will the United States still be able to do the pivot, given the Middle East? And my answer was, this has always been in addition to, not instead of, these other issues. The United States remains to have global interests. The idea here was we were understanding that Asia was changing, and that we needed to give more focus to it, but not necessarily as a we can forget about all the other issues. I think Asia and the Middle East will be two of the highest priorities of this administration. And I think, or maybe I hope, that climate change will work its way into that as well. And in all of those, I think that the goal is not to, somehow end this, many centuries-long conflict between Arabs and Israelis, but to make significant progress that's sustainable and you can build on. Yeah, I think, and I'll segue into drones maybe on that because they're both technology. I think this is, on cyber wars, I think a lot of countries are realizing that we need some rules of the road, some rules of the game out there, right? And, a lot is being attributed to China, whether it's directed by the government or it's arm's length directed by the government or not. There was this Stuxnet virus that allegedly, the United States, Israel, some others, planted in the Iranian nuclear technology to slow it down. Well, Iran, which we don't necessarily think of the same way we think of China and the United States or Europe, has also been demonstrating knows how to do cyber hacking too, right? So this is a technology that, a la the diffusion of power, there are a lot of countries that have it, and it's not just countries, it's the whole, the world of the hackers, the world of the Stieg Larsson novels, right? That really, exists out there. And I think it's a very problematic area because governments have much less control over it than they do of, say, trying to deal with, nuclear proliferation or something. And ultimately, I think there's going to have to be a global process on this to try to develop some understandings, because one may think I have an advantage now, I can hack you and gain an industrial secret or a military technology secret, but you're going to be able to hack me and a little bit down the road. And it does relate to the drones thing that I'll just sort of segue into. I think the president's speech the other day, I encourage you to read it. It was the longest speech he's given other than his State of the Union addresses. And he really tried to wrestle both with the issues for our political system, about how you make these decisions, secrecy versus non-secrecy in our own system. And the great debate out there, and a lot of scholars and NGOs are researching this about, you may make a gain you think is a security gain by killing certain terrorist leaders, but how many terrorists do you create, by that? I've been looking at a lot of the literature on this, leaving aside American policy. I think it's an area that really we're not sure of that answer yet, and I think a lot of good study needs to be there. But drones are also a technology that others are going to have and already have. And so part of it, I think, from an American point of view, same thing came up during the Iraq War, where we just sort of threw out, the Geneva Conventions and torture and everything. And in fact, there was a lot of our military that would say, we don't want to do that because we're afraid it'll be used against us down the road. And this is kind of this notion of, so much is changing in the world that we have to think of what's in our interest in ways that aren't just serving the immediate moment. And the cyber area, it's going to take some understandings from non-state actors, from businesses and others to try to find some rules of the road there. But it's the most sort of super empowered individuals as well as governments behind this.
Sheer size
So I think North Korea is the country that we, know the least about in the world. So whether it's a pivotal moment, I would have a hard time saying. But I think the encouraging part of this is, for many years we've been pursuing what are called the six-party talks, which was a recognition that it couldn't just be the United States and North Korea, which was sort of the deal that was worked out back in the early 90s and didn't hold. But it had to be the six parties. And that of those six parties, really Beijing, China was very important. And China's traditional position has been that they worried about destabilization of North Korea by, in effect, squeezing them too much that might create, both a flow of refugees across their borders and the concern about a unification of the peninsula with American forces there. China's interests, I think, are the same, but I think they seem to be going through a question of, whoa, maybe a different strategy has a better chance of serving those interests, right? And I think that's kind of what we've been seeing a little bit lately is, no, maybe this regime really needs to be pressured and to know that it's not just angering the Americans or scaring the South Koreans or the Japanese, but, we don't want them to, this is not in our interest either. And there have been a variety of indicators, including this notion, as I said before, but, so much of international affairs is relations among leaders and psychology, and the notion of this 28-year-old, whether he's doing it or not, I know it really offends Chinese leaders, who consider themselves much more experienced and sophisticated as they are. So we could be moving towards an interesting situation there, and I think two things will become key, and these will be important things for our administration. One is, to the extent that China is putting some pressure, greater pressure on North Korea than before, it will probably want to do it in its own way, which is less standing up at a press conference saying it than we tend to do. And secondly is to not take a position that says China's doing this because we pressured them to do it, right? That would just fly in the face of their own sense of their interest and their pride. And again, I think from the statements coming from the White House so far, I think we've been doing that pretty well. The other question will come, and it relates to the point I made about American military presence in the region. It would be wrong for the United States to say to allies like South Korea, we want you to know we're prepared to bargain away our military presence in Korea if we can get a deal with North Korea, and we're here just to tell you we're going to do that. But I think one can envision a scenario, in fact, a couple of colleagues from your College of Asia Pacific were saying this at lunch, and I'll just quote them, it wasn't mine. You have a South Korean leader who has her own agenda, who speaks Mandarin, who understands the Chinese, who can see the importance of a China-Korea relationship. Can we move, through a process where there's a denuclearization of North Korea, not necessarily unification, and there is an understanding that the United States over time would end its military presence on the peninsula in ways that reduce the threat for China, that South Korea is comfortable with, and that contribute. I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think those are the beginning pieces that one can see. Now, the North Korea pattern has always been one of these. I think within another month or so, we'll see something that we feel things are, kind of coming asunder. But I think that this is an area where there is a little greater convergence of interests. Some of the statements coming from Beijing have been about denuclearization of North Korea and the peninsula. And this is where diplomacy becomes very important. And it is a lot harder in the internet, media, transparent age. There's a lot of things that you need to keep quiet until you build the political support at home, right? When Israel and the Palestinians negotiated the Oslo Agreement back in 1993, they did it at a hunting lodge outside of Oslo. CNN wasn't around. They did it very quietly, and it's almost like a flower in a greenhouse. When it's strong enough, you bring it out of the greenhouse, and they did. And again, it didn't totally succeed, but it accomplished a great deal. So I worry sometimes that we'll get some agreements, and then you get, factions within one or the other governments that don't like where it's going, and they leak it to the press, and it falls apart. It's a very complicated process, but that's kind of where I anticipate that going. I don't know if soft power necessarily plays into that, but it's really more about kind of sort of traditional diplomacy, I think.
Hi, thank you. You've mentioned the relationship between China and the US and on a political level.
Yeah, people in our business, academics or policy commentators or bloggers, love to get, their catchy phrase, and I think this Trimerica is one of those. I don't think it's a little bit like the notion of a G2 world, right, that it's going to be US and China. And part of it is, again, the pluralization of diplomacy. Many countries have interests that, and many countries are very proud of the fact that in this, the Cold War is over, colonialism is basically over, and they can be out there, pursuing their own national interests. I think our two economies are the largest in the world. There are some interdependencies. There are a lot of issues between us, and indeed in the 2012 campaign, frankly, both Republicans and Democrats China bashed on trade issues. Sort of the nature of campaigns, unfortunately, but it's the way politics are. What I would like to see is us work out our issues in ways that are starting points for others to build upon. So, on the climate change, Copenhagen was a disaster. And I think it was a disaster because for a lot of reasons, including it's very hard to negotiate with 192, just think of any situation that we're all in. And there were a lot of other things going on, and we had not, made any progress at home, so we didn't have much credibility. But, and there is some cooperation going on right now, technologically between the US and China on cleaner coal and the like. So if we could say we have both, and China style seems to be, doesn't necessarily want the international community to set its standards, but I had another statistic in here, I could find it quickly that I didn't read, investment in renewable energy by China was up 20% in 2012 to $65 billion, now the highest in the world. And they have set targets for themselves of a 40% cut in emissions relative to economic output by 2020 compared to 2005. Which is different than saying, sure, we'll let Copenhagen or others do it. So if we can find bases, and I think the international financial system and the trading system are like that too, where we can work out our differences in ways that then set the stage for others to get involved on issues in which our policies are so big a part of it. That can be a country region. But the notion of somehow we're going to work out our economic or other issues and dictate to the rest of the world, investors won't play that game, and I think the rest of the world won't either. So that's my sense of the Trimerica or the G2 or the G0 world that some people talk about as well.
Good evening. I'm an honours student at the College of Asia and Pacific, and I would like to ask you just a couple of questions about America's relationship with Japan in the context of the pivot and the Great Eastern Japan earthquake. So with regards to the earthquake, did the assistance that America provided to Japan, Operation Tomodachi, actually deepen the relationship, the alliance?
The assistance after the earthquake, you say?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
As was said by Hillary Clinton and the former Defense Minister Kitlar on a few occasions. And was the cooperation, in a sense, a projection of power and the solidarity of the alliance towards China, a kind of geopolitics and disaster?
On your first question, I was in Tokyo October 2012, to give a talk. And at the conference, there was a lot of discussion of 3/11 and the response. And I think that the U.S. military presence, played a huge role in that. I mean, very good at logistics, disaster relief. And there was a lot of appreciation on the part of the Japanese people for that. I think it didn't make issues like Okinawa go away. But I think it created a larger context that showed that the American military presence could really help the Japanese people in some ways that affected their lives directly. So I think in some ways that was a good thing in and of itself, just for younger generations that hadn't had the same relationship with each other. In terms of the overall security alliance and strategic alliance, it's very tricky, and this is my own view. I don't can't attribute it necessarily to the administration. I'd say a couple things. One, Japan clearly has its own issues to work out that have to do with history with South Korea and China. again, confessing to my limited knowledge. First time I was in South Korea was the late 90s. And, I'll confess to my own limited knowledge. I didn't really know much about the Japanese colonial presence in Korea in the early 20th century. That's its responsibility in this region. And I think we need to stress that in ways that say, to the extent that you have tensions with your neighbors that are attributable to that, but you sort of want to frame them as, China's aggression or something, we don't necessarily accept that, right? Because then it sort of gives them too much leverage over us. And when you have an ally, you want to stand by the ally. China needs to know that the United States will not accept, China settling the islands issues with Japan in a coercive way, that we have a commitment to. At the same time, we need to let Japan know that they don't have a blank check, because they could play into their own sort of right-wing politics and say, well, America's our ally, their credibility's at stake, so we're going to push over on the Chinese in ways, and so it's another delicate diplomatic balancing act that's important. The credibility of standing with your ally, but not reversing the leverage. Again, I think a lot of Middle East, we have this same issue with a lot of Middle Eastern countries. During the Arab Spring, when the human rights and political reform movement started in Bahrain, in March 2011, when everything else was happening, and it's a Sunni monarchy, but 70% Shia population. And the Saudis came to us and basically said, oh, it's Shia, they're going to be linked to Iran. And in fact, the Bahraini Shia have much sense of their own national identity. And the Saudis and others invaded, right? And they were very mad at us. But we tried to say, you're our ally, we have shared interests, but on this issue, our interests are not shared. Now, we haven't, I'm not sure we have this policy fully right yet. But in other ways, it's analogous. When you have an ally, our relation with Israel are very close, and we are fully committed to Israel's security. But as we saw in the first Obama administration, that doesn't mean we agree with every policy Israel wants to pursue. And I think that's, so to put Japan in that larger alliance context, it's not just something, and the Japanese, it's important they understand that. It's not just about you, but in any alliance relationship, you need some assurance from us, but you can't be so much that you feel you have a blank check from us.
Is there actually a schism, polarization between the right and the left, or the Democrats and the Republicans in the US on America's national interests vis-a-vis China?
That's a good question, John. In the 2000, I teach a course back home on the politics of foreign policy. You and I were talking about this the other day. And I had my students, even before the 2012 election, look at commercials from the 2010 election. And you had, in places like Michigan, Democrats bashing China as well as Republicans. It's sort of a populist issue. Paradoxically, it's an issue in which sort of the Tea Party and the Occupy movement actually have some shared positions, because they're both kind of come at it from different directions. The Occupy movement from sort of criticism, left-wing criticism of corporate America, Tea Party from sort of a little bit of xenophobia. So I think it's more about the populist appeal to those blue-collar workers that both sides were trying to turn out. And during the third presidential debate, and here I will put on Truth in Advertising. So I was on President Obama's National Security Advisory Steering Committee during the campaign, and spoke on his behalf, debated Republicans, wrote op-eds. And then, of course, the game was winning the election, so my view was only talking about the things I thought they were doing right, whereas tonight I'm trying to be a little more analytic. The Romney whole foreign policy approach was, I was actually here in Australia last May, and I gave a talk at the Lowy Institute on foreign policy in the American election. And some of the people there were trying to tell me, oh, there would be no difference between Romney and it's all about election. He really basically, on strategic issues, totally bought into the neoconservative position. And on this issue, I think there's a neoconservative, because they're into the rising power theory, and it's not just trade or the other. In fact, there's stories that on election night, Romney actually really thought he was going to win based on his polls. And people in the foreign and defense policy community were having a party at somebody's house in Washington, all celebrating the positions that they thought they were going to get. So not quite Truman and Dewey with the newspaper headline. Whether he would have shifted or not as president, it's impossible to say. But boy, the positions he took, my wife and I were actually in Cuba in November after the election. And they were convinced that it was going to be Bay Pigs all over again, down there. In fact, one cab driver said, "Dame un beso a Obama para Gustavo." Give a kiss to Obama for Gustavo, the cab driver, because they were. So I think there was all, what Romney would have done as president, impossible to say, but he went way in the neoconservative direction as part of his political strategy. And, in some ways, but it was, and I meant to say at the beginning, this was the first election in many, many years in which the Democrat polled better than the Republican on foreign policy and national security issues. And that was very significant. And granted, the election was mostly about the economy and related issues. But those of us working on the foreign policy side, had it been a close election, 5 to 7% of the electorate is voting on foreign policy. That could have been your marginal difference. So I think it showed that the American people, had general support for the Obama foreign policy and trusted his judgment to a great extent. And I think whatever the political strategy was that Romney was pursuing didn't work.
Question here, and then we'll have time for just one more if there is another one. And then we'll
Peter, your views on Syria.
Good. And thank you, because I just mentioned in passing what could be done now? There's a lot of talk back home on arming the rebels. Senator McCain went and apparently met with the rebels the other day. The EU has just lifted its arms embargo. I think some of that is probably helpful, but it's tactical, not strategic. Syria, when this started in Syria, also in February, March 2011, in the context of the Arab Spring, the demands of the Syrian people were not that Assad go like Mubarak, Gaddafi, or Ben Ali in Tunisia. It was for change. And it became what it did because of the way the Assad regime responded. Brutally, terribly. And I think there also is evidence of some atrocities on the rebel side. And there's no single leader like there wasn't in Egypt, but it's very complicated. I've been, and again, this piece I wrote last week, I'm calling for a diplomatic surge, not a military surge. I think that the longer this goes on, the worse it's going to be in every sense, humanitarian and otherwise. I think the international community needs to rally. I think this conference that Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Kerry agreed to hold, I think it's in Rome or Geneva, I can't remember. It needs to be not just process, not just a communique, but a serious effort to take this to the next stage, which is a political transition. If the Russians would change their position and allow a Security Council resolution and put some pressure on Assad and give him an exit for his family or whatever he wants, we could then move to the next stage, which is going to be really hard. It's going to require, quite frankly, a serious UN peacekeeping and political observer process. It's going to require tough efforts by everybody, with all of the factions who now had their old differences and now a whole lot of eye for an eye, to try to have a process that is not violent. I will not bet a single American or Australian dollar that it's going to be easily achievable. But what we're seeing now is the regionalization of the conflict. It's spreading to Lebanon. It started to spread, to Israel. The Turks, Jordan is bearing an enormous economic and other toll from the refugees. We're going to have a full Middle East war unless we try to find a way. It's sort of the point that was made earlier, not to necessarily solve, but start to manage and contain and ratchet down a little bit the Syrian conflict. And the U.S. has a role to play in this, but it is not ours to do alone. It has to be part of a serious international coalition. There may be a U.S. military role in it, but it has to be part of this kind of coalition. But it's really more about a diplomatic surge. And United States gets criticized a lot, as we did in Iraq, and criticisms that I agreed with. But I've actually been quite concerned that there hasn't been a lot of international outrage about Russia on this. You just don't hear a lot. I mean, they should be taken to the cleaners for what they've been doing and not doing in this. And the international community, I think, sometimes, and again, I've been critical of my own policy, sometimes it's easier to criticize the United States. But I think anyway, those are some components that would help.
Last question.
As part of the pivot policy, we've seen an increased military presence by the U.S. in the Pacific. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what the sequester in the U.S. is doing to impact this policy. There's a chance that we might see the deployments in Korea and Japan get reduced or even...
From the sequester, you said? It'll have some impact, but there's always a way of working budgets out for your priorities. And the point I started with, I really think to the extent that these deployments change, I think it will not be because of fiscal constraints. Fundamentally, it will be because of shifts in what are the best ways to maintain security for allies and stability in the region. And to deal with this security dilemma with China. So I don't think it fundamentally threatens that. I would say, I could provide you with a real expert on the sequester, who's a member of our family. Our young son, not so young, 31 years old, is a high-level aide to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and so he knows all about the sequester and all about the backstories, and could probably give you a better answer than me to the rest of it. But I really want to stress that this is really about shifts in the world more than fiscal constraints. I mean, it's a serious thing. Some money will get put back in. But fundamentally, I mean, the bigger issue here is, can we as a country show the policy capacity to deal more effectively with our own issues than we have been, than the gridlock we've had. And that's our real challenge in terms of our soft power and in terms of our own effort to really deal with some tough policy issues.